Well, let me say good morning to everyone as you're coming into this webinar. My name is Peter Loewen. I'm the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and it's my pleasure to just say a few welcoming remarks in this event on the Indo-Pacific strategy of Canada and the United States. Before I do want to acknowledge the land on which I'm sitting, in which the University of Toronto operates. It has for thousands of years been the home of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and more recently the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we're very thankful to be able to work and play and thrive here on this little part of Turtle Island. This is a wonderful panel, and I'm going to turn it over in just a moment to Professor Lynette Ong, who's organized this panel and will very ably moderate it. And I'll just say before that at the Munk School, like at other places, we're watching very closely the new Indo-Pacific strategy that's been launched by the government. We had the honor of having our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mélanie Joly, at the school last week to do a kickoff speech for that, and we know that this is really rolling out in real time at the ASEAN meetings, at the G20, and over the next few weeks. So we've got a wonderful panel here to talk about this pressing issue, and really importantly, it's happening in kind of a broader North American context. So let me just say thank you very, very much to Lynette for organizing this wonderful event, and I'll turn it over to you, Lynette, to introduce our great guests and to moderate. And I'm going to fade into the background as a very interested observer of this panel. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Loewen, for the opening. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the virtual seminar on the Asia-Pacific strategy at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. My name is Lynette Ong. I'm a professor of political science at the school. So we have a truly distinguished international panel of speakers today, and I'm very privileged to be organizing and moderating this event. We're also joined by audience from all around the world. So the Indo-Pacific, as you might know, is a region that stretches from Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia and to South Asia and Oceania, including the Pacific Islands. And it accounts for over half of the world's population, including 58% of youth, 60% of global GDP, 2/3 of global economic growth. Therefore, it is imperative for the United States and Canada to engage with the region. But also, more importantly, the Indo-Pacific is critical because China is a big part of it. Following the U.S. release of its Indo-Pacific strategy in February, Canada is due to release its long-awaited strategy later this month, which will articulate our strategic positioning. So it will be an important piece of paper, and how we will deal with the increasingly authoritarian China under Xi Jinping's rule, and how we will engage with the Indo-Pacific region, partly as a counterweight to China. And Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly gave a sneak preview at the Munk School last week, which was chaired by Professor Loewen, which she spoke about, China as an increasingly disruptive global power. And the China of 1970 is not China of today, which these rhetoric are quite different from that of the Trudeau's government in his first term. And of course, the world has changed a great deal since then, especially since the jailing of the two Michaels by China. So to help us make sense of all these, let me introduce today's speaker. So we are very privileged to be hearing from first Dr. Evan MEDEIROS, who is the Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies at Georgetown University's Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service. He has a decorated CV, and I'll just highlight that he has served as President Obama's top advisor on the Asia Pacific and was responsible for coordinating US policy towards the Asia Pacific across various areas. And then next up, we have Guy Saint-Jacques, who has a very distinguished career at the Canadian public sector. Mr. Saint-Jacques has worked for Global Affairs Canada for nearly 40 years. He has served as Deputy High Commissioner in London and as Deputy Head of Mission in Washington, D.C. He was Canada's Chief Negotiator and Climate Change Ambassador from 2010 to 2012, and served as Canada's Ambassador to China from 2012 to 2016. He is currently a Fellow at the China Institute at the University of Alberta. Our third speaker of the day is GOLDY HYDER, who is the President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. And earlier in his career, he served as the Chief of Staff to the Right Honorable Joe Clark, the former Prime Minister of Canada. GOLDY was also previously the President and CEO of Hill and Knowlton Strategies. Last but not least, we have Jonathan Miller, who is Director of Indo-Pacific Program and Senior Fellow of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He is also a Senior Fellow with the Japan Institute of International Affairs. So our US expert, Evan Medeiros, will set the stage and provide us with a 10 minutes remarks and followed by 5 minutes remarks by each of our Canadian experts. So without further ado, I will hand over the mic over to Evan.
Well, Lynette, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate being invited. I think that collaboration between America and Canada on the Indo-Pacific is an important area. Lynette, as you stated, I served for 6 years on the staff of the National Security Council working for President Obama. And in that time, I recall very fondly my collaboration and close cooperation in conceiving and implementing the Asia pivot with colleagues in the Canadian Foreign Ministry. And I'm glad to see that collaboration and cooperation continues. And I, like you, anxiously await the new Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy and hope that it provides lots of opportunities for America and Canada to work together, because clearly dealing with the Asia Pacific, whether it's North Korea, China, or broad and narrow cooperation without Southeast Asia, I think it's pretty clear to all of us that aggregating capabilities and, most importantly, having like-minded countries working together in common goals is going to be important. And of course, the America-Canada relationship is just one of those examples of how we can work together. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about America's approach to the Indo-Pacific. And to prepare, I reflected on the experience in the early Obama administration, because we were conceiving of and writing the original pivot strategy. And the whole idea on the pivot was actually quite simple. And interestingly, it was not all about China. In fact, it was not even substantially about China, though of course China was part of it. It was based on a belief by President Obama and his top advisors that the United States had been overinvested in parts of the world like the Middle East, where America's interests were shifting and changing, and underinvested in those what we sort of called asset classes like the Asia Pacific, where our interests were only growing. So if one thinks about foreign policy, or American foreign policy, as an exercise in asset class allocation, the idea was that we were underinvested in the parts of the portfolio that were likely going to appreciate, and overinvested in the parts of the portfolio that were unlikely to generate the kind of returns we wanted. And so we began this process of laying out the pivot. And the logic for the pivot is one that is well known to those of you that study American foreign policy. In fact, American strategic interests in the Asia Pacific go back hundreds of years. My colleague at Georgetown, Michael Green, wrote a wonderful book tracing the evolution of U.S. strategy toward the Asia Pacific. And it's pretty clear that Asia houses over 50% of the global population and close to 2/3 of the youth in the world. It's 60% of the global GDP. It accounts for 2/3 of global growth. In Asia, 65% of the world's oceans, 25% of its landmass. And then, of course, there's several nuclear weapon states. And if you're an American, the fact that there are 5 treaty allies in the Asia Pacific really matters. So from an American perspective, our interests in the Asia Pacific are persistent and consistent. And they've been that way for a very, very long time, dating back during the Cold War and even before. And the U.S. approach in response to that, I think, has demonstrated a fairly high degree of consistency. In other words, what are those policies and strategies that America has adopted to reflect the consistent American interests? And from the U.S. perspective, there's been a sort of fairly clear set of policies that America has adopted to defend the diverse, enduring interests in the region. Those policies include things like modernizing and updating our alliances, improving America's interactions with regional security institutions, enhancing America's economic engagement with the region, investing in long-term sources of American strength, and then improving American diplomacy with the region to ensure that our friends and partners in Asia are contributing to both regional governance as well as global governance. And I think that those general strategies have evolved over time. You see more recently the American commitment to working within regional organizations being reflected in new institutions, or I should say revitalized institutions like the Quad, or most recently, American efforts to continue to do more with Southeast Asian countries. Of course, President Biden is just returning from Southeast Asia, where he attended the summit of both the East Asia Summit grouping, held another meeting of US ASEAN leaders, and then attended the G20. So the US approach to the Asia Pacific, I would say, reflects consistent interests. I think the strategy has been very clear, though the manifestations of that strategy, the manifestations of those pillars that I talked about, have changed and evolved over time as the challenge in the regions have evolved. And probably the biggest challenge in the region that has evolved over time is China. And so I want to talk a little bit about where China fits in, because while I completely understand that the Chinese saw the pivot strategy and they see much of what the US does in Asia, whether it's the Quad, the US ASEAN leaders meeting, TPP, or even the US, UK, Australia defense coordination agreements, we understand that they see that all as designed to counter China. But what we made a decision in the Obama administration, I think that's reflected in the Biden administration, is that US policy and US strategy can't be driven by China's greatest anxiety or China's paranoia, because the practical reality is, regardless of what you do in the Asia Pacific, regardless of how you articulate your interests, regardless of how inclusive you are, Beijing is very likely going to see it as all about Beijing, right? That I think, at least in the US-China relationship, is a very consistent and persistent theme. And what I would say is that US policy, toward China has evolved in that context. Whereas US strategy and policy toward China from much of the end of the Cold War, so let's say the 90s and the 2000s, was very much focused on shaping China's choices, trying to encourage China to liberalize economically, trying to encourage it to the extent possible and with very, very modest and reasonable expectations to pluralize politically, but perhaps most importantly, to become a more constructive contributor to regional governance and global governance, and using US strategy toward Asia and using our bilateral relationship to try and moderate Beijing's instincts. So what we used to say in the Obama administration is that our policy toward China was a mix of cooperation and competition. Cooperate where we could and try to encourage China to contribute more to solving regional and global problems, but compete where we must. But try and find an equitable balance as a way to demonstrate that the Thucydides trap, the inevitability of conflict between an established power and a rising power, wasn't inevitable. And what I would say is that over time, as China became more insular, as China became more ideological, more state-directed in its economic development, and then especially under Xi Jinping, as China became more active, assertive, coercive, and now even openly aggressive, in particular on issues of maritime territorial disputes, or even with China, as Xi Jinping's China became more its strategic intentions became clear, the United States increased the role of the competitive dimensions of its policy, and as a result, correspondingly, the opportunities for cooperation shrank. And so I think where the nexus of the Indo-Pacific strategy and China come together is that for many American strategists, the use of the Indo-Pacific strategy was about shaping the environment in which China was rising, in the hope that you create an environment that encourages China's better instincts and discourages it from coercive and aggressive behavior. And in the pivot strategy, that was part of what we were doing, but we were also engaging the Chinese very intensively, using this dual method of engaging with the Chinese in intensive, often high-level diplomacy to address problems, to find greater areas of cooperation, to prevent sort of worst-case assessments from dominating, but also making sure that America was well-positioned in the Asia-Pacific. So if China didn't turn out, or if China sort of started trending in the more coercive direction, that we would sort of have a insurance policy or hedging strategy. And I think what became clear throughout the 2010s as a decade is that Xi Jinping was leaning more toward the active, coercive, even aggressive side of external behavior. And so the hedge element of the Indo-Pacific strategy simply became more important. In other words, it was more important for the United States to protect its interests in the Indo-Pacific by leaning into those 5 pillars that I outlined related to our regional, our approach to the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's sort of where we are today, is that the Indo-Pacific strategy is about protecting American interests in the region, but an important part of that story of protecting American economic, security, political, diplomatic interests in the region, big part of that story is trying to deter and respond to Chinese coercive, and aggressive behaviors. Now, I will admit and stipulate that that America's interests in Asia are somewhat different than Canada's, for the obvious point that you don't have 5 treaty allies, and your relationship with Taiwan is different than the American relationship with Taiwan. So that's a big, obvious difference between the United States and Canada. But I think it's important to recognize that as China has cast a broader shadow on the world stage, as Chinese coercive and even mercantilistic economic practices, as you experience with the 2 Michaels and America experienced with Chinese exit bans, oftentimes Chinese coercive practices, affect countries well outside of the Asia Pacific. So I think that even if you don't have treaty allies in the region, even if you don't have a Canadian version of the Taiwan Relations Act, because Asia is now such an important part of the global economy, and I think it's rapidly becoming a pace setter in terms of global security interactions. I think Asia is becoming what Europe was during the Cold War, the center of gravity of global politics. I think the premium on Ottawa and Washington cooperating and coordinating in our Indo-Pacific strategies, in our interactions with China, is only growing. Because what's become very clear is that if we have any hope of deterring Chinese coercive and aggressive behaviors economically, militarily, diplomatically, our ability to work together is going to be an essential part of that story. So I'm very happy to be here today. I look forward to exploring more opportunities for America and Canada to work together as we defend and protect our interests in the Indo-Pacific, but also as we all struggle with the great challenge of China as a rising power under Xi Jinping. Thank you, Lynette. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Evan. Guy and Jacques.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hong, for the invitation. So first, I would like to say that I was quite encouraged by the speech that Minister Joly gave at the Munk School last week. And I think what we are witnessing is a long overdue shift in Canada's approach to China. There's also a recognition of the growth potential of the rest of Asia and the need to diversify our markets. But I would say that the strategy is a lot more than just about trade. And I was also reassured to hear the minister talk about our 5 objectives that go from security to development to climate change and so on. Of course, as we heard from Mr. Medeiros, China has changed a lot under Xi Jinping, but I think it took the arrest of the 2 Michaels for the Trudeau government to finally acknowledge that China has become an authoritarian regime that has significantly increased repression internally with the tragedies happening in Xinjiang and Tibet. It is also conducting an aggressive foreign policy marked by the disregard of international rules and the use of coercive actions like hostage taking or the imposition of punitive tariffs. You know, I would say that the challenge for Canada is how do you deal with an insecure and immature superpower? I was not surprised that President Xi didn't want to meet with Prime Minister Trudeau. In fact, if you look at what preceded the speech of Mrs. Joly, first there was the decision on Huawei to prevent him from developing 5G in Canada. Minister Freeland in Washington a month ago spoke of the need to diversify our trade, and she talked about friendshoring. This was followed by Minister Champagne asking 3 Chinese companies to sell their interests in Canadian mining companies, and then Minister Joly comes in and say China is a disruptive superpower. Things won't get better, unfortunately, for Canada. You know, there was almost no political dialogue in the last year, despite the fact that Meng Wanzhou and the 2 Michaels had been released. The good news is that China agreed to the nomination of Jennifer May as Canada's ambassador to China. I wish her the best of luck because she has a difficult mandate ahead of her. I would note on the trade side that last year we had a record year with almost 29 billion worth of exports. So that was plus 14%. This year, the story is a bit different. Our exports are down 13% after 7 months. Trade is still dominated, as it has been for a long time, by commodities and agri-food products. And the slowdown, of course, can be explained by the economic slowdown and turmoil in the real estate and in the sector. I don't think that the upcoming Indo-Pacific strategy that will be unveiled soon, I hope, I don't think that it will refer to decoupling and friendshoring. There may be reference there, but I think it will be left to companies to decide to which extent they want to reduce their exposure on China. And let's remember, it's not a country that buys, it's companies and consumers that buys products. In terms of the details released so far, of course, the seriousness of the new strategy will be judged in Canada and in the region by the amount of new resources that will be devoted to the exercise. So far, the announcement by Prime Minister Trudeau at the ASEAN summit of some $330 million devoted to the region strikes the right note as it increases bilateral assistance and the number of people who will focus on the region. I also noted that the communiqué marking the 45th anniversary of the Canada-ASEAN partnership addresses security issues like freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. I will also be interested to see how much is devoted to security. I would note that buying additional ships could serve to protect our sovereignty in the Arctic, as well as having the capacity to participate in more exercises in the region. I also look forward to hear more about what is proposed to reinforce alliances with friends and allies to push back on China. Also, what will be proposed to counter China's interference in Canada. In terms of how China is going to react, well, we got a bit of that by watching the exchange, the impromptu exchange that took place earlier today in Bali, where an agitated Xi Jinping threatened, in my view, the Prime Minister. He was clearly unhappy with the fact that the Prime Minister had reported on their discussion the previous day. And of course, China will continue to say that, to claim that Canada is the lapdog of the United States. I would say that, despite the fact that Canada was extremely helpful to China in the environment and public public health sectors, let's recall that CIDA, our Development Assistance Agency, spent over $1 billion. We helped to create the Ministry of the Environment in China. I could recite a long list of things that was done, but I don't think that China, I would not be surprised that China refused to engage with Canada in a more restricted fashion. As to be frank, as the Chinese don't have a high opinion of the Prime Minister, I think it will be incumbent on Minister Joly to try to build back bridges and to convince China that we have huge differences, but we have to work together. In concluding, I would say that the Canadian government is following the right approach, one based on the defense of our values and interests, the recognition that trust has been broken, and that China must respect international laws and stop acting as a bully. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ambassador Saint-Jacques. GOLDY?
Well, let me just begin by saying, first of all, that thank you to you and to Peter and the Asian Institute and Munk and U of T more broadly, because you're the kind of organizations and institutions that are going to need to reflect the seriousness of the time in which we find ourselves. I'm quoting Larry Summers when he said, it's time for a new seriousness. And I think that seriousness requires a mature and a very eyes wide open or clear-eyed discussion that I think we're going to be able to have here. There are things I agree with that have been said. There are things I disagree with what have been said, and some are more fundamental and others are more nuanced. And business has that tendency to try and find that nuance because it has no choice. And business doesn't operate in a vacuum. Canadian businesses and American businesses, in fact, not only just compete, but cooperate and have to navigate these quagmires that we're discussing here. And often do. So I welcome the opportunity to have that serious and mature discussion, because the times are complicated. The geopolitical situation is alive and well, and it's changing. So we're encouraged by seeing President Biden and President Xi try and reduce the temperature a little bit on some of the stuff that we've been hearing with regards to the so-called devolution and so forth. So from a business perspective, we do think that common sense will ultimately prevail over the course of time. And I'm taken by Evan's remarks on the notion of the Indo-Pacific strategy more broadly being one of the opportunity to shape a region to appeal to not just China, but I think more broadly, greater sensibilities of countries at a time in which our citizens are looking for that. And let's not forget what this is all about. They're the ones who suffer if the wrong policy choices are made, whether they're economic or military or foreign policy or trade or any other policy that takes place. Now, specifically to the topic at hand, because I don't see this as a discussion about China, I see this as a discussion about the Indo-Pacific, which happens to include China. I think the overall message for Canada is it's an opportunity for us to remind everybody, including our friends in the United States, that Canada is a Pacific nation, that we also are a Pacific nation. And I'm pleased that Secretary Blinken and Minister Joly were able to find a way forward where Canada's application and hopefully full admission into the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework will take place, because it was an oversight perhaps, but it's not one where Canada could have afforded to have been on the outside looking in. It was important to be in that discussion, in that conversation, irrespective of where it goes and whatever a framework is supposed to be versus a trade agreement. The fact is things are happening over there and we should be a part of shaping that. And so the launch of the Indo-Pacific strategy will allow us to not just remind Canadians, but more broadly our friends and allies around the world that Canada is also a Pacific nation. And it's an important distinction, seems rather obvious, but clearly needed to be made given what happened with the IPEF situation. Secondly, just to point out that I did co-edit a book with two other authors or editors entitled The Indo-Pacific: New Strategies for Canadian Engagement with a critical region, and there are a number of chapters in there. And I think I just wanted to make a plug for that. It's available on Amazon. But more importantly, the content that's in there comes from a variety of different places, and I thought the audience would be able to look that up. What we talk about, and then in the chapter that I've authored from a business perspective, we really look at the three things. One is that the region represents a tremendous opportunity for growth. That's kind of stating the obvious. But we need to be present. We need to be there. The growth that's going to be taking place in these countries is phenomenal, and a lot of it is driven by just great demographics and emerging middle class markets, new trade infrastructure, and so forth. So we're encouraged that our government has obviously we have a Korea trade deal. We have the more broad the CPTPP. We're having discussions with India. Hopefully, something will come of that sooner rather than later, even if it's just an agreement to date. And then the Indonesian exercise that Minister Ng and others have taken lead of. We welcome that. We think the trade infrastructure is the kind of stable, predictable environment that business communities, irrespective of nationality, look for in the investment choices that they make. And let me be clear, currently, there is just tremendous risk out there for businesses. And that's why you're seeing a lot of capital frozen. And the risk is not just in one form of government or another, it's in all forms of government. I mean, risk comes in different shapes and sizes. We have political risk, we have security risks, we have regulatory risks, we have investment risks, we have all kinds of risks that are out there that are trying to be managed. And so the Indo-Pacific is an opportunity to get a narrative that it welcomes capital. That it welcomes that investment, and that it is a reliable and predictable and stable environment in which it can take place. We recognize that every country has its own regimes that need to be navigated, but it is an opportunity to show that capital is welcome at a time in which capital is frozen. The second thing we note in the chapter is the importance of diversification. Now, this is an overused term here. We've been talking about it for a long time. What we really mean is we have too many eggs in one basket, and we've reduced the exposure to the United States from sort of 85% over the last 3 decades or so down to about 75%. We're probably on our way to be 65. And I make the point, it's not necessarily an indication of less investment. It's you can grow in the United States and still reduce your influence there, to reduce your exposure there, while growing in other parts of the world where, frankly, it's flat earth. There's a lot of opportunities for Canadian business and Canadians more broadly to grow. We have a great footprint in terms of our large companies that I have the privilege of representing, including our pension funds, and they've been very mature and sophisticated in their exposure to managing risk around the world. And when Minister Jolie came out with her remarks, she highlighted China, but the truth, as I mentioned, is risks are everywhere, and business risk is in the business of managing risk. And we welcome the opportunity to be able to have our own decisions made in terms of our investments, in terms of our accountability to our shareholders and to our communities and to our governments. We welcome the idea of the so-called 3C strategy, if you will, the notion of cooperating and competing and challenging. And frankly, we think we should be doing that with everybody, including ourselves, and looking inward as well to say what are our own areas that we can do better at. And that's something that, again, I think requires a serious and a mature discussion to take place. The issue of our time, where I think the opportunity really exists, is climate change. And businesses are going to have to be a critical part of that in terms of the innovation, in terms of the capital that's going to be necessary, in terms of the regulatory predictability that we're going to need. And this means you got to work with everyone. You can't pick and choose who you're going to work with, because the emissions know no boundaries, and they don't do customs and immigration. So we've got to figure out a way to work together to help, really purify the air that we breathe. So that's an opportunity, in our opinion, to ensure that we can cross the lines on other areas where there are going to be disagreements. And let me be clear, there are going to be fundamental disagreements. And as I said, there are many things that have been said that certainly I think Canadian business would align with. But we're also, to our eyes wide open point, China is not Russia. What happened in Russia is not going to be possible in China anytime soon. And so anybody who thinks that this is a good idea doesn't understand the importance of the ability to bring your public with you and your customer in this regard. And we saw that in Europe. When you move too quickly, to pivot to renewables, and you didn't have the capacity to keep the costs, in a level in which customers could afford it, the public, slingshot back, and the government had to respond back. And so we have to be very careful. These are complicated relationships, the trading and infrastructure that's in place, the supply chain integrity that's in place. It's a long strategy. It's not a quick play. And so the development of the Indo-Pacific is a critical component of that. Last point I just want to make, and I'm going to be making it quite a bit here, and I made it to the minister in my conversation with her, is the difference between intentions and actions. We want to make sure that the policy metrics that are being there are measured in terms of, are we actually doing it? And I think part of that requires a partnership, a much more mature partnership with our government and governments more broadly. In the Indo-Pacific region, governments are a price of entry. They're table stakes. If you don't ante up with your government, you're not able to enter the market, and you have more challenges than you perhaps need as a business. Businesses have entered markets without trade agreements. Businesses have entered markets without governments. I'm just saying it's easier on everyone, of businesses of all sizes, if we can have a more cooperative relationship and a more robust collaborative partnership with government and business and other stakeholders and businesses of all sizes. There's this emphasis these days, because it's kind of cool to talk about SMEs and all of that. The reality is big businesses are the ones that go into these markets. They have the resources, they have the capacity, they have the relationships, they have the partnerships, and that facilitates the growth of our SMEs. And we should partner with our SMEs and others to bring them in so that they have an easier entree into what is a very complicated environment, not just politically, but economically, in which to operate. So I hope our government would give serious consideration to looking at perhaps bringing back our more formal Team Canada efforts, because I think in the Indo-Pacific in particular, they would be necessary, and business would certainly welcome them. So let me stop with that, Lynette. Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan?
Well, thank you, Lynette, and to the Munk School for organizing this. And I think a testament to a lot of us 3 years ago, if we thought we would still be talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy, had hoped for different. But the good thing about these delays is that we have more time to discuss these important issues, and especially the interties with the U.S. So, I very much appreciated Evan's remarks at the beginning. Full-throated agreement with Goldy's last comment that Canada is a Pacific nation. I think sometimes we need to remind folks of that. But two other important points is that we're a G7 nation, and despite the fact that we have our differences with our neighbor, we are a North American nation. I think that's an important point that sometimes we forget. So, for example, when looking at other countries and how they've approached the Indo-Pacific, I think we're looking at our European friends, the Dutch and the Germans. The EU itself has released an Indo-Pacific strategy. But one thing that I'll constantly remind the Canadian side is that as much as we share things with the Europeans and there's shared values, there's shared interests, we are not in Europe, even though some officials and politicians perhaps wish they were in Europe. So we have to calibrate those interests based on the realities of where we are geographically, and the fact, as Goldy mentioned, that we very much are a Pacific nation. An anecdote on this is I was in the Netherlands in February, and the Netherlands have released their Indo-Pacific strategy in November 2020. And they were asking me, they said, as happy as we are to have our own Indo-Pacific strategy, Canada, you're a G7 country. You have a massive Pacific coastline. You sit there cozied up right next to the United States. How is it feasible that you don't have an Indo-Pacific strategy and we have one? So I think that we need to be thinking deeply about these things. So quickly, I'm going to mention 5 quick points about what I'd like to see in this strategy. I think I would agree that Minister Jolie's sort of pre-positioning speech at Munk had some positive signs in it. But again, hearkening back to, I think it was Goldy and other panelists mentioned, we need to see actions rather than words and intentions. So we need to see this specifically on the ground and for the long term. So the first point that I would make is interests. We have to realize, even though Canada hasn't done a great job of articulating its own foreign policy interests, we have to realize that this strategy is in our interest. This is not a house gift to the Japanese, to the Koreans, or to the Americans saying, okay, well, we'll engage in the Indo-Pacific because you want us to. I know you're worried about a strategic competition with China. We have to realize fundamentally this is in Canadian interests. And a few of those interests, obviously, we can list a lot of them, but are maintenance of the rule of law, peaceful settlement of disputes, disputes, free and open commerce, stable energy supplies. So we have to fundamentally get that point that this is not something that we're doing for our allies in region and partners in the region, but this is fundamentally for Canada's commercial and security interests. The second point, and this gave me a little bit of worry with some of the statements that have come out so far and some of the announcements that came out this week during the summits in Asia, is that we need empathy in the way that we approach this strategy. Any strategy, of course, has to put your interests first, your interests and values, but we also have to be talking to the region. We can't just introduce a strategy and have, even if it's 5, 6, 7 billion, the money number is not going to matter if we're not actually talking to the region about what is the Canada that they expect, what is the Canada that they want. And we have to fine tune that balance, obviously, with our own interests. So I think that discussion, we've been off in the past several years. We've been doing a lot of sort of echo chamber talking to ourselves and making ourselves feel good about what that engagement might look like. But we need to actually talk, to the Manilas, to the Hanois, to the Tokyos, to the Seouls, and understand what specifically is the Canada that they want and expect in this region. The third point that I'll mention is balance. So when we think of a strategy, I think Canada for too long the balance has been completely out of whack. It's important that we promote our businesses, that we promote investment. I'm a big fan of the CPTPP and hopefully the expansion of that with more partners. But the economic side is just one piece of the coin. And the second part of this is that when we say national security and defense, we shouldn't bifurcate these. In my mind, these bifurcations never existed, but they absolutely don't exist in today's world. When we're talking about economic security, we're talking about energy security, we're talking about tech supply chains. We need to think about these two in a similar shared space. It's not ceding the ground to one or the other and saying that all things economic have now been domineered by national security. But I think that we need to see the interplay between geoeconomics and geostrategy as one rather than two separate areas and engage in that field. The fourth point I would say is creativity. So we need to be creative in the way we engage. You'll talk to a lot of Canadians, and in addition to most people in the region saying we love Canadians, we want to be involved in any club that's multilateral. Give us a point card and we're in. But the reality is that the Asia Pacific is not the same as the transatlantic. We don't have NATO. We don't have the OSCE. We don't have the OECD. NATO does. The Indo-Pacific does have some multilateral institutions such as ASEAN and APEC, but they're not as well defined or necessarily as purposeful as some of those in the transatlantic. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us in a very uncomfortable place in Canada. But one that we have to play in. We have to start thinking about some of these mini-laterals, such as Quad, such as AUKUS. It doesn't mean that we necessarily join as a fifth member of the Quad or a fourth member of AUKUS, but we need to start thinking much more creatively about what instruments best serve our interests and combine that with the multilateral engagement. And the last point I would make before handing it back over to you, Lynette, is sustainability. That was another worry I had in these initial announcements that came out, is that I know it wasn't the intention, but to frame things as years, the idea that we're doing a project for 5 years, on ocean funds, for example, we need to think about this in the long term. This is no 5-year, 3-year, 10-year engagement. The Indo-Pacific we're in for the long haul. And we really need to act like that in the way that not just we approach it as a government, but I think that the way that we work hand in hand with the private sector, the way that we work hand in hand with academics, with think tanks, with all parts of the Canada team to make this engagement effective. So thank you very much, and looking forward to more of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So we have about 15 minutes left, so I will try to pose a number of questions to the panelists, and if we have time, I'll take questions from the floor. And I think our Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, which we have a sneak preview of last week, to me signals a fundamental shift, at least in tone and rhetoric, from one that is friendly towards China to one that is ambivalent, or if not, sounding caution aware of, about the sort of power that China is becoming. And thinking back of what Evans said earlier, which is interesting that you said, during Obama's administration, the Asia is pivot towards Asia rested on two legs. One is cooperation and one is competition. But then after that, as Xi's administration, China under Xi got more and more authoritarian. Cooperation has kind of faded away, and what you have now is a competitive sort of relationship. And of course, that has ramifications for not only Indo-Pacific of the United States, but it has domino effect on Indo-Pacific strategy of Canada and foreign policies of other democracies. So my question to Evan is, do you think this shift towards competition only type of thinking is a response to increasing authoritarian nature of China, or is it partly a response of changing economic conditions within the United States to income inequality, pluralization, polarization of its politics, and partly as a way to address is changing competitiveness within the domestic economy, which is what we are hearing from Beijing from time to time.
Sure. Thank you. It's an excellent question. So first, let me clarify. U.S. policy going forward is, while the shorthand is one of strategic competition, the Biden administration has been very clear. Where there are opportunities to cooperate, we should work together. And I was reassured by the fact that President Biden, in his comments with Xi Jinping yesterday, basically said, look, whether it's food security, emerging market debt, or climate change, the US and China need to be working together. The challenge is the Chinese aren't really interested. Or to put it differently, the Chinese say, we're happy to cooperate with you, but we'll only do it under these conditions, which is you change your policy on Taiwan, Tibet, and Xinjiang. So the Chinese approach to cooperation continues to be, if you pay me enough for it, I will engage in cooperation with you. And it's notable to me that coming out of the meeting yesterday, the Chinese claims of cooperation remained as diffused and as vague as ever. So I think Xi Jinping continues to look at the world and define Chinese national interests pretty narrowly. And when we talk about cooperation on global challenges, the way the Chinese interpret it is, I will engage in bilateral consultations with countries and help them out in the hopes that China, gains something for it. I think it's a very material cost benefit calculus on the part of the Chinese. So I'm sure you can tell, I'm pretty skeptical of these Chinese claims of wanting to cooperate. They articulate them in terms of the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, but I think the Chinese are not really that interested in any kind of cooperation that doesn't result in an immediate and tangible material gain for them. On the competitive side, I think that that's simply a recognition on the part of the US that American and Chinese interests diverge more than they converge, and they diverge on a whole variety of issues, right? The US-China relationship is very much a broad spectrum competition now. Competition on national security issues, competition on economic issues, competition on technology, and increasingly on questions of ideology. What ideas are going to govern domestic politics and even global governance, right? I mean, in the Chinese readout of their meeting with Biden, they refer to themselves as a whole process democracy. I think this group I hope that we can all agree that whatever the Chinese political system is, it's not democracy, even whatever they call whole process democracy. So there are real differences in ideas. The Beijing's response to that is, well, we don't want a competitive relationship with the Americans. It's just America's mismanagement of its economy, of income inequality. It's the American outsourcing of its national anxieties that's leading to competition in the US-China relationship. I think that's Beijing's narrative. I disagree with it. In fact, I think that because China has become more insular, and in particular, because the Chinese economy has slowed, because Xi Jinping has taken a more statist orientation, less market-friendly orientation toward economic growth, I think the political economy of the US-China relationship is changing because American businesses have become somewhere between ambivalent, at best ambivalent, about doing business in China. What you see is, and look at the recent survey of the US-China Business Council. I see GOLDY sort of shaking his head. GOLDY, take a look at the US-China Business Council. Perhaps like your organization is probably the one that's it. They are very articulate, very credible purveyor or credible views on the US-China relationship. Look at their most recent member survey. What the members are saying is they find operating in China more challenging. They find that their profits, their market share, their revenues are all down. They all say that when they look at new investments, they're not looking at China for new investments. That's not to say they're leaving China. It's just their future investments, they're looking elsewhere. So to get back to the whole issue of the political economy of the US-China relationship, what you find is that those voices in the United States, the Bob Zellicks, the Hank Paulsons of the world, who used to be strong advocates of the US-China relationship, because they hoped that the long-term trajectory was economic and perhaps political liberalization in China. I think they've come to very different views about what China's political and economic trajectory looks like. I think that's gradually, incrementally being reflected in the investment decisions of American businesses, right? Look at Apple. Apple's, finding that the unreliability of or the uncertainty and unpredictability of the business environment in China is proving very, very problematic, and especially for an iconic American company like Apple. So while the Chinese may put forward that notion of American outsourcing its anxieties, I think what we're seeing is just across the various interest groups in the United States, you're seeing a shift in views about being in China, operating in China, cooperating in China, and really views about the overall direction. And that is reflected in public opinion in the United States. And I think that reflects the reality of the decisions Xi Jinping is making. He is restraining the role of the media, he's restraining the role of the private sector, right? Look at private sector investment in China, onshore Chinese investment, it's way down. So my view is the reality of China is changing. And as a result, I think the reality of decision makers and interest groups in the United States toward China is changing, which has all created more momentum to seeing this relationship in more competitive terms than cooperative terms, not taking cooperation off the table, right. Hoping that China episodically and for whatever reasons will engage in enlightened self-interest and actually work with the United States and Canada and others on global issues. But if recent behavior is any indication, we shouldn't hold our breath.
Okay,
over
great.
to you.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 questions, so each of our panelists will have a chance to respond. So GOLDY, you made a number of important points about what you like to see in the Indo-Pacific strategy. So in international relations, there's a concept called weaponized interdependence, which is some big trading nation uses its important trading relationship as a leverage to punish smaller nations, such as Australia, such as Canada. Our canola oil has been a victim of that. So when Minister Jolie say, going into China, investors going into China with eyes wide open, what does eyes wide open mean to you? And how could we be better prepared of potential punitive measures coming from China as we speak out against human rights abuses in Xinjiang, in Tibet, and in Hong Kong?
Yeah,
1 minute.
Yeah, acknowledge 1 minute. Okay. Well, let me just say that, first of all, I think that more broadly, what you've seen is an alignment of Canadian response. Canadian shaping of its policy with the United States. Even last night at an event in Ottawa, I hear that the ambassador of the United States said that the policy goes even further than the administration might have expected it to do so. So I don't think there should be any question in terms of how Canada's lining up in terms of how we manage that situation. I think what we want to be careful of is linkage doesn't work. Usually in foreign policy, linking things to if this, then that. And maybe the Chinese need to learn that as well. But it's certainly something I learned here in Canada, that foreign policy linkage to other issues is a complicated way of having policy outcomes that you might want. Thirdly, I would just say that in the situation in China, yes, there's a verdict is out, and it's particularly out on the management of COVID, to be very honest. Europeans and others are all looking and saying, wow, if this is how you're going to manage the next crisis, not exactly the way that businesses would want to see that done. I'm not going to dispute the survey, because it probably aligns with the survey we've done ourselves. Those are facts. My only message is the idea that everyone's just up and leaving, and that we're all just shifting, and that we're all looking at new markets is simply not happening. In fact, what I'm encouraging Canadian businesses to do is be careful and others to not extract yourselves while others are still hanging around, because they've been around for a long time. We've been there ourselves. Some Canadian businesses have been there to such an extent that you've seen revolutions, wars, pandemics, including Spanish. You've seen, all kinds of issues emerge, and you're still there because you know how to navigate that. And so I think there's a short-termism to the way we see things. We have to think long-term. They're going to be the #1 economy in the world. We are going to have to engage. And I take the cue from American businesses who continue to be present, continue to find ways in which to do business with their eyes wide open, and by aligning with the policy interests of the administration of the day. What business is primarily looking for when it comes to your question is clarity, just clarity of rules. Be clear about the policies on all sides. I mean, the other day, we had a policy decision here from a national security perspective around critical minerals. Be clear. These are the things that you're allowed to be investing in. These are not the things that you're going to be able to invest in, whether it's coming this way or it's going the other way. All sides need to give business clarity on what the rules are. And that's something that I think that we could benefit from. And ultimately, that trickles down to benefit our societies, because our economies hopefully grow and people get prosperity through that.
Okay, thank you so much. So I don't know whether we could extend this conversation by another 10 minutes. I'll leave it to our administrator. But Ambassador SAINT-JACQUES, any last thought given our discussion so far? How should we be better prepared with our Indo-Pacific strategy, potential counter reactions from China, and how should we invest ourselves in the broader region?
Well, I would say that in terms of the region, yes, we have been less visible in the last 10, 12 years, but I would say that, we were previously much engaged, and I would encourage the government to look at what we have done in the past in terms of development assistance with countries in the region. And there is a good basis to build on this. I think that it will take a while to build back confidence, but hopefully we'll go there. I agree with Goldie in terms of what the business needs. It's clarity, predictability, and in fact, this is something that we have been missing with China. You don't want to be at the receiving end if you are a canola farmer in Western Canada, or a pork producer in Quebec. And I think there are ways there where we have to work with allies to push back on China when it uses those coercive actions. There was a study done by the Australian Strategic Institute published about 2 years ago. China has used those methods 152 times between 2010 and 2020. And each time that China imposed punishing tariffs, the country has to go to WTO, and we have to work among allies to agree on sanctions and agree that maybe we would not take advantage of the punishing tariffs imposed on Australian barley to increase our own export. I would say let's limit our export to our historical market share. and to send the message to China, the time to divide, to conquer is over. And the message to China is simple. You know, we want to do business with you. We want to have relations, but you have to stop acting as a bully, and you have to respect international laws.
Thank you so much. So Jonathan, last words go to you.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think we have difficult choices, frankly. You know, we have limited resources, and the perception gap is really important. So one example I give, and I'm a big fan of our European friends and opening up new missions in the Baltics, for example. We announced 4 new embassies in Europe. But what does the perceptions look like that in Asia when the foreign minister goes out and announces 4 new embassies in Europe? But the Indo-Pacific, as many people here rightly have noted, is the center of gravity in geoeconomic and in security terms. I think we need to get those priorities right. They're going to require difficult choices. Some of them are going to be on the business side. Many of them are going to be on the diplomatic side. I think where we reposition lots of our diplomats, it's not just about opening new embassies in Laos and Cambodia, but it's about looking at that footprint. Some of them might be very difficult choices, for example, in China. Some of the consulates that we have in China, some of the amount of diplomatic footprint we have there. It's not to say that we up and run and reduce completely our footprint there. No one's saying that. We need a significant engagement in China, but we have to think of that balance. And I think the last point I would make is, you know, Canada, and this is very, very difficult for Canada, and I think it goes back to the multilateral point I meant, is that we cannot be all things to all people as much as we want to be. We want to be all things to all people, but the reality is that we have certain interests and certain values, and there are certain states that share those values very closely with us. And I think the United States is one example. So, you know, I've heard some commentators talking about this strategy saying that, you know, we should be careful not to side too closely with like-minded countries or quote unquote the global West, meaning our European friends, you know, Quad Plus, et cetera. I think that's the worst idea ever. I think absolutely we should be working with countries that share our interests and values. It does not mean, though, on the same hand, that we shouldn't look to build ties with ASEAN and others and understand the complexities in the region. But the idea that we shouldn't work with countries that share our most, you know, our most sacred values and interests, I think, doesn't compute with me.
Okay, great. So, you know, on that note, in the last hour, we have covered a lot of ground from the United States evolution of pivot to Asia, to its Indo-Pacific strategy, and to Canada about what the businesses are looking for and what we should watch out for. So I'm afraid that's, you know, what we have the time for today. I want to really thank our distinguished panelists from joining us today from Washington, D.C., San Diego, to different parts of Canada, and apologize to our audience that we have not been able to take any questions, but thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.